Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and this time around I'm going to answer the top 3 VR/image stabilization questions I get from my fellow wildlife photographers, namely tripod use, shutter speed, and which modes to use. Note that these are not brand-specific guidelines, however, in my experience, they do work pretty well across at least the big 3, Nikon, Sony, and Canon, and I'm confident they apply to other systems as well. The basic way stabilization works is fairly consistent from one brand to the next, so these guidelines should apply to just about any camera. Also, in my experience, the advice with VR and stabilization can vary a bit depending on the particular lens in question, how stable the user or any supplemental support is, if there are TCs involved, the type of movement, what generation the lens is, and sometimes even the way the mass of the camera and lens interacts with the stabilization system. Heck, even adding a grip sometimes has an effect. So the advice in this video should be treated as a starting point. Now that said, what I'm presenting are the VR/stabilization guidelines that have served me well over the years. In addition, if you have a mirrorless camera with IBIS, that will generally combine with any in-lens stabilization, and I find all the guidelines in this video still apply. In fact, at least in the cameras I've used, IBIS is always on when lens VR or lens stabilization is. You can't use them separately, and I believe that applies to most systems. Also, remember that VR and stabilization only work to minimize movement on your end. They do nothing to prevent subject motion. Finally, a quick note on the quality of the stabilization system. The truth is they are not all created equal, and unsurprisingly, the more you spend on the lens, the better the stabilization system tends to perform, and the more likely you can use it fearlessly at higher shutter speeds or on tripods or things like that. So let's dive into the details. 1. VR/stabilization and tripods. One of my most frequent questions is, can you use vibration reduction or image stabilization with a tripod? Well, it depends. First, if you're using a tripod with a head locked down, I would always shut off any kind of stabilization system, even for those lenses that can sense tripods. If you're locked securely down on a sturdy tripod, there should be no need for stabilization unless it's like crazy windy or something. Also, to kind of paraphrase Nikon, Canon, and Sony, they all sort of mention that stabilization may not be fully effective or in some cases recommended for tripod use, and they go on to say something along the lines of depending on the type of tripod and shooting conditions. Now, I think this translates to avoiding stabilization on a stable, fully locked down tripod. However, if you're using a tripod with a loose head, as most wildlife photographers do, or if you're using a monopod, things get a little more complicated. In those situations, you're not as stable as you are on a lockdown tripod, especially at slower shutter speeds. So with a loose tripod head, usually a gimbal head in my case, I usually leave stabilization turned on if my shutter speeds are on the slower side. I've done this with Nikon, Canon, and Sony, and have had better results with it on than with it off. Again, at least with the cameras and lenses I've used. As for specific shutter speeds with stabilization and loose tripod heads or monopods, I tend to follow the 1 focal length rule. For example, if I'm using a 500mm lens, I tend to leave stabilization on if my shutter speed is 1/500th of a second or slower. If it's faster than that, then that's when I'm going to start thinking about shutting it off, but it depends on how sensitive the particular stabilization system is to faster shutter speeds and how important viewfinder stabilization is for me at that moment. In fact, let's take a deeper look at this. 2. VR/stabilization and shutter speed. Another very common question is at what shutter speed should you shut off stabilization, or should you shut it off at all? This is where the quality of the VR system in the lens comes into play. Now, depending on the lens, you can sometimes see a loss of acuity at faster shutter speeds, generally once you get over 1/1000th of a second, but sometimes as soon as 1/500th of a second. I've had lenses like that. This loss of acuity is generally not seen in every image, but you may spot 1 or 2 photos in a series that just don't seem as sharp as the rest when they really should be. However, we have to tread carefully here since there are a ton of other factors that could come into play, especially with longer glass. We could be facing heat distortion, particulates in the air, AF misses, poor technique, etc. Still, anecdotally, I have noticed what I believe to be slight drops in acuity when shooting faster shutter speeds on some lenses, and often that problem seems to go away when I turn off stabilization. So I'm inclined to believe that in some cases, stabilization does have an effect on image acuity at higher shutter speeds. The trick is that faster shutter speeds don't affect every lens in the same way. I find that modern lenses seem less problematic than older generation optics, and the more expensive the glass, generally, the less I concern myself with shutting off stabilization when the shutter speed starts to climb. So my advice is to test your lens and camera combo and see for yourself if there's any issue shooting at higher shutter speeds. The thing is, there's not a specific shutter speed I can recommend that would apply to every lens. However, I do have a very general guideline. Until you have time to test, shutting stabilization off between 1/500th and 1/1000th of a second is a fairly safe bet for most glass. That said, I don't know that there's any lens out there that's completely immune to an occasional drop in acuity when stabilization is on, so it's not a bad idea to shut it off if you're using a shutter speed that's not really helping you increase your keeper rate. For most shooters and situations, once you get faster than, say, 1/1600th or 1/2000th of a second, shutter speed is doing more to keep your image sharp than stabilization is. However, there's another aspect to this. Keep in mind that VR and stabilization systems also have the not-so-insignificant benefit of stabilizing the viewfinder. This not only makes it easier to follow your subject, it also seems to aid subject detection and tracking systems in keeping on target. In addition, the extra viewfinder stabilization can come in handy at times when you're trying to shoot from like a safari vehicle with a bunch of excited people moving around, when you're in a awkward position, like you're low to the ground and you're not very stable, like when it's really windy outside, or maybe when you're shooting from a bobbing boat, those sort of things. And I often use stabilization in all of the above cases and more, even at faster shutter speeds. And that's why it's so important to test and learn how your lenses behave at higher shutter speeds with stabilization. If I have a lens I know does fine at higher shutter speeds and I'm in a situation where I would benefit from some added stability, then I'll leave it on. On the other hand, if I have a lens that's a poor performer at faster shutter speeds, and I have had lenses like that in the past, then I'd forego the extra stability. However, to make that choice, you have to know your lenses. 3. Which modes should I use? This is going to apply to my Nikon, Canon, and Sony friends, but I think most other systems follow a similar methodology. First, we have normal on Nikon and mode 1 on Sony and Canon. This is your everyday stabilization system and is generally recommended when you're shooting a more or less stationary subject and want to utilize maximum stabilization. I think this is also a good choice when slower shutter speeds are necessary and you require every ounce of stabilization assistance. Next, we have our stabilization modes for panning. Nikon auto-detects if you're panning, so you can use either normal or sport mode, although I prefer sport mode here. For Sony and Canon, this is mode 2. Regardless of which brand in this mode, the camera will compensate for movement in the opposite direction of your pan. So in other words, if you're panning horizontally from left to right, mode 2 in Nikon VR Sport or Normal will compensate for vertical movement, but won't interfere with your horizontal side-to-side motion. Finally, we have Sport mode on Nikon and mode 3 on some Sony and Canon glass. When shooting in normal VR mode with Nikon or mode 1 on Sony or Canon, it's not uncommon to experience a sensation of movement or even jumping in the viewfinder as you're shooting. This has the unfortunate side effect of making the image in the viewfinder kind of lurch around a little bit and can make it more difficult to keep the AF area where you want it on the subject, especially a moving subject. Sport or mode 3 minimizes this effect and makes it easier to track more active subjects. So when it comes to my action work, Nikon Sport VR or mode 3 if I'm using Canon or Sony is where I tend to set my stabilization. As a side note, on my Nikon Z series cameras, I tend to use sport mode almost all the time because the jumping sensation with normal VR is often just a little bit over the top. That and Nikon Sport VR seems nearly as effective with static subjects as normal VR, so not a big downside. If you know anyone who would find this video interesting, feel free to share it. Oh, and if you want more VR info, make sure you check out my recent VR battery life test video. I think you'll really enjoy it. As always, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more of my videos, and make sure you check out my educational materials at my site. I have tons of books and video workshops that will really take your wildlife photography to the next level. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.